Hello. In this video, I'm going to be making a TV stand out of this bookshelf. It was a little bit too tall for where my TV was mounted in my living room, so I started by chopping the top layer off. Just to even things out a bit, I use my flush cut saw to chop off some extra debris. Now up here I had a nail or a staple or something, so I threw my flapper disc on my angle grinder to clean things up a little bit. I also, from the Sawzall cut, I had a little bit of tear out on the sides, so I just decided to take that flapper disc and the sanding wheel and taper in the sides a little bit just to clean that up, and it'd be all under the tabletop either way, so it's hidden. I'm not really too critical about the perfection of this project because I don't intend to sell it at all. It's just for my living room. And either way, I think it's going to look great. Then I decided this bookshelf needed a little flavor because bookshelves are kind of boring. So I grabbed my router and I decided to make a decorative edge on each of the shelves. I just got leftover paint that I'm using for the interior of my house, so I'm just going to go ahead and make this thing match my living room. Hopefully it kind of blends in a little bit with the tabletop standing out. Now I had a little problem. I painted into the slots that I routed out just a little bit. So I'm adding this masking tape to protect the paint while my router glides on top. I also adjust my depth down a little bit on my router, so that way I cut a little bit deeper, so that way I can be sure to clean that gouge out a little bit more. Now it's tabletop time. I'm thinking I'm going to have this thing hang over 4 inches on both sides. So I take my tape measure, make my mark, verify, get my number, 44 1/16. Move it over to the other side. (44 1/16). Grab my square, run my line. I took the same decorative edge bit on my router, ran an edge along the tabletop. Right there was a noise that I did not like to hear. I had a little bit of blowout. The chip just flew right out on me. And after a second of me deciding what to do, I decided to just go right over it and make that the back end of my TV stand, just to try to hide it. And then finally, I realized I needed to wear a dust mask. Should have been wearing one the whole time, but better late than never. Another quick routing tip is you always want to run your router on the wood in the opposite direction of the blade's rotation. If you do not do this, it will just want to run along the wood and shoot out and ruin your workpiece. And to clean it up, I used a 120 grit sandpaper disc. Now I get to slap on my homemade wood stain. I made this stain out of 2 handfuls of steel wool, 2 quarts of apple cider vinegar, and I just filled that jar the rest of the way up with some water and let the rust take place. It's an old recipe that was passed down. It makes for a nice dark wood stain, even for wood like aspen. That's a lighter wood like I'm using here. It's a nice traditional American look. And I decided to add some of that wood stain to these the decorative edge that I did earlier with the router. Now when I put this tabletop on, I'm going to use some clear glue, but so I don't have to use clamps and risk clamp marks on the epoxy pour, I'm drilling pilot holes through the bookshelf for these screws to go through. And when you drill these holes, you want it to be bigger than the screw, like I was demonstrating there, so that way the screw can go through the pilot hole and only thread into the tabletop. Now I'm going to take this wing drill bit and pop out some holes for any cords for gaming consoles that I might want to slip through there. Should have done this before I put all the paint on, but it's just going in my living room and I don't mind adding a little character. Now back over to the tabletop that I stained the bottom of earlier. I flip it over and now I'm staining up the top. Now here I am adding an oil-based polyurethane coat. The first of 2 that I'm going to do for this piece. I'm doing this just to make sure before the tabletop epoxy coat I'm going to completely seal this wood off, so that way no gas or nothing like that is coming out of the wood when I put the epoxy on top. That could cause a lot of bubble trouble. The surface will be super rough after you add that polyurethane. A lot of the fibers will stand up, so you need to sand it back down. I sanded it back down with 120 grit sandpaper, cleaned it off, and got ready for the next coat. Here I am putting the final coat of oil-based polyurethane on the tabletop piece. After this, it should be good to go. Now time for chemical warfare. In front of me you see all of the supplies I'm using for this epoxy pour. Everything safety wise, right here. Got my safety glasses, my gloves, I'm good. Got my putty scraper to move around the epoxy. Sponge brush, just to hit the edges. My heat gun, just to take care of any pesky bubbles that may arise. You want to make sure your surface is level before you pour the epoxy to keep everything in the middle. I'm using the glaze coat. It's made by Fama Wood. It's a tabletop epoxy. It's thicker than the deep pour stuff. Comes with a hardener and a resin. Normally, tabletop epoxy is a 1:1 ratio. As much as you pour in a resin, you want the exact amount of hardener in that mixture. This one, that is the case. In the instructions, it'll tell you how much square footage you can cover per epoxy mixture. Just so happens that I'm able to cover both of my tabletop projects that I'm working on with all of this pack. So I'm going to be using the full bottle of hardener and the full bottle of resin. Don't have to do any exact measuring. It will also tell you in the instructions that you're supposed to have 3 cups. You pour all of the resin into your first cup, and then all of your hardener into the second cup. Then you pour the resin into the second cup of hardener, mix it for 6 minutes, and then pour into a third cup, mix for an additional 6 minutes for this epoxy to get up to temp. I only have 1 cup, so I'm going to take a chance here and see what happens. I'm just going to mix it up extra well and make sure I'm scraping all the edges and hope for the best. 1 full bottle of resin into the pot. 1 full bottle of hardener into the pot. As soon as you add that hardener, that resin and that hardener will begin to cure. And you want to beat the crap out of that resin and hardener until every little resin molecule and every little hardener molecule has made a epoxy baby. Now, while I'm mixing this stuff, I should probably tell you that I worked through some troubleshooting before with epoxy, and you want your room temperature to be in a certain happy spot before you let your epoxy sit and cure. That happy spot for this tabletop epoxy, and I think most epoxy, is from 65 to 75 degrees Fahrenheit. If it's too low, the epoxy will be too cold and will not cure properly. It'll take too long to cure. It may not cure at all if it's too cold. And if it's too high, it'll cure too fast. And I've heard about epoxy even curing so hot and so fast that it begins to smoke, and smoke's rolling out of people's workshops, and it gets pretty crazy. Another thing that can cause some issues is if you're holding the heat gun too close to the epoxy table, it can scorch the surface. Now enjoy this montage of me working this tabletop epoxy all over these tabletops. Now to finally attach my finished tabletop to my TV stand, I'm just measuring to make sure my overhang is even on each side. Once I conclude that it is even, I make my corner marks so that way when I throw the glue down, I can just slide it into place and then add my screws.